The Star Wars sequels trilogy will be remembered as one of the greatest disappointments in cinematic history, and for not much else. But when I call this trilogy a disappointment, I'm not really referring to the quality of the filmmaking, acting, or overall technical competency, which are all points of criticism frequently made in reference to the Star Wars prequel trilogy. I mean that we have at last confirmed my suspicion that the perfect storm of brilliance in the original trilogy is now only a small dusting in comparison to the endless Category 5 hurricane of mediocrity that has since followed. How depressing. I think the main problem with the sequel trilogy was that it never really justified its existence. It was created based on the assumption that people were so desperate for more Star Wars that they would enjoy anything you threw at them. Of course, what we were pitched was different. Disney was going to revitalize Star Wars after the shortcomings of the prequels and propel the franchise into a new era to be enjoyed by a new generation of Star Wars fans. Even throughout the production of the first film, it seemed like these guys were on the right track. They got a director involved with a decent reputation with adventure films and television, a guy who seemed like he had some of the same energy as young George Lucas. They were using costumes and practical effects to try to recapture the charm of the original trilogy. They even got most of the actors back to reprise their roles. But then, they started releasing the movies, and it began to slowly dawn on people that nothing original was being presented to them, the creators were unable to commit to a vision, and overall, nobody working on the movie had a full understanding of what made Star Wars so revolutionary in the first place. I often dread the inevitable conversations I'll be having with my future children about my love for Star Wars. My son will say, "Dad, what was your favorite movie when you were a kid?" And I'll respond, "Well, son, it would have to be Star Wars." And then he'll go, "Which one, Pops? The one with the wrinkly old alien with anus eyes? The one where the old guy squeezes green goo from an elephant's memories? Or the one where they ride a space horse across a ship as it's exploding everywhere?" And I'll have to say, "No, son, I am of course referring to the one where the two main characters share an incest kiss." Now it's a tired and obvious complaint at this point that Episode 7 was just a rehash of Episode 4. And I know some of you Star Wars nerds out there defended Episode 7 to your dying breath. I defended it at the time too. We said, it's just the first episode of the trilogy. We don't know exactly where they're going with it. We said, it was actually smart to reboot the series to undo the damage done by the prequels. And while I certainly can't fault anyone for thinking that at the time, we now have the full context. Even to begin with, it was actually kind of vain of them to think they could fix Star Wars with Episode 7. They could have easily made it stand on its own instead of only being refreshing to people who didn't like the prequels. The energy they used doing so would have been so much better spent learning from the mistakes of the prequels instead of rebooting Episode 4, which doesn't even make any sense if you think about it. The thing is, I will acknowledge the prequels had major problems.
The Techno-Union Army.
I know that there are people who will look back on them with some kind of smugness, as if they were some kind of misunderstood masterpieces, and everyone was an unenlightened sheep for rejecting them. From a technical perspective, the movies were poorly paced and directed, they relied on an overabundance of CGI, and were shot like a documentary or something. From a creative perspective, Lucas wasted time with an unconvincing love story, and added a boring bureaucratic aspect. At least he had ideas in the first place.
It's another Death Star.
I wish that were the case, Major. This was the Death Star. And this is Star Killer Base.
They were really weird ideas that often didn't work, but at least there was some attempt at original world building. But even though Lucas had some legitimately good ideas, they were often squandered by his method of execution. Battle droids, for example, was a great idea, but the way he used them was in a war as an opposing force to clone troopers. So we end up with two expendable armies with no autonomy, and we're supposed to view this as some kind of gritty conflict with a heavy emotional toll? This, on top of a confusing storyline involving separatists and a trade federation, kind of diluted the idea with a pointless lore that you'd expect to find in a book or something. Certainly not a fun for the whole family sci-fi adventure movie series. I guess I'll have to crack open my copy of Star Wars: The Toes of Darth Sidious to get the answers to this. Anyway, I might cover the prequels in a separate video, so let me know if you're interested in that. By contrast, the sequels didn't attempt to give us anything we hadn't seen. Apparently after Episode 6, the Empire is destroyed, but then somehow comes back as the First Order, which is essentially Imperials 2 Electric Boogaloo. Forget about how it took years and years for the original Empire to infiltrate the Republic, using its existing connections to transform into a galactic superpower. Psych! Guess we just need an orc and an e-boy with daddy issues and we'll be up and running in no time. This would all be fine if they used that as an opportunity to introduce new technology, right? So, you put a color invert filter on a TIE fighter? Well, that's cool, I guess. At least it will sell more toys. Oh. What I'm trying to say is that if Disney really wanted to refresh Star Wars' image, they should have learned from the prequels instead of assuming everything they did was wrong because it was made by Lucas. Build up the smaller background elements that make Star Wars what it is, but do it with competent storytelling and compelling characters. To Disney's credit, they're doing this with that show, The Mandarin Orangian. They took Boba Fett and the Bounty Hunter world, which was a fairly unexplored part of episodes 5 and 6, and built a pretty cool TV series. Each of the Star Wars trilogies up to this point had a focus. The original trilogy focused on Luke's journey to the Force. from his humble beginnings as a farm boy to his struggle to live up to his duty as a trainee, and finally his confrontation with his father as the last step to completing his training as a Jedi. The prequel trilogy was a lot messier. We start with Anakin's discovery on Tatooine, but then in episode 2 we kind of get the Obi-Wan movie. Then Anakin repeats pretty much the exact same character arc in episode 3, except this time he murders children instead of sand people. But despite the messiness, you could at least say the prequels were about Anakin's descent into Darth Vader and the dark side of the Force. Well, what is this new trilogy even about? Apparently it's about family.
It's about family, and that's what's so powerful about it.
What definition of family are we even using, though? You see, in the original trilogy, we had a clear main character, through whose eyes we were receiving the story. Obviously, Leia, Han, and Chewie, and the others were main characters too, but the story revolved around Luke's journey and his place in the rebellion. So they did the exact same thing, except with Rey with the sequels, and now instead of a few main characters, we have one protagonist and a revolving door of supporting characters. This also includes members of the original cast, like Han Solo in Episode 7. The obvious comparison to make would be between Han Solo and Ben Kenobi in Episode 4. I read recently that the reason why Kenobi dies in Episode 4 is because George Lucas couldn't actually think of a reason for him to stick around, but at least Obi-Wan actually serves a purpose up to that point. He tells Luke about the Force, gives him his first lightsaber, and even trains him a little. What does Han Solo do? Arguably, he only needs to show up at the end so Kylo Ren could kill him. A lot of the problems with this trilogy come from the creator's overreactionary tendencies. The Force Awakens was an overreaction to the sloppy storytelling and lack of original trilogy charm in the prequels. The Last Jedi was an overreaction to the unoriginality and over-reliance on the original trilogy of The Force Awakens, and The Rise of Skywalker was an overreaction to the un-Star Warsiness of The Last Jedi. Well, let's talk about The Last Jedi for a minute. The only thing I really liked about The Last Jedi was the stuff with Rey and Kylo. I think Adam Driver is a pretty great actor, and he gives a compelling performance of this rough-around-the-edges ex-Jedi who struggles with a conflict between good and evil, which is a pretty foundational conflict in the Star Wars universe to begin with. There's this idea that Luke is somewhat responsible for him turning to the dark side, which caused Luke to reevaluate his connections to the Force and go live as a hermit on some oceany planet. Whether you liked it or not, it's an original idea at least, and it's certainly not as dumb as abandoning your wife and going back to being a smuggler. The problem with this is we have it offset with two other underwhelming story arcs involving characters who I don't really care about. It becomes eminently clear that Finn and Poe Dameron are stupid and useless characters. The one character trait Poe is given is that he's a good pilot, but I'm pretty sure everything he does in this movie just gets people f***ing killed. And then there's Finn and Rose, and honestly Rose gets a good amount of undue hate. I think people were frustrated with her character because she takes time away from developing the other characters who we've already established, like Finn and Poe. The truth is, Rose has more motivation than either of those two characters. Her sister gets killed, so now she feels a sense of commitment. I'm not saying it's a great motivation, but Finn's character arc was essentially completed within the first 20 minutes of the first movie, and nothing Poe learns really influences his character in any way further down the line.
Leia.
Certainly not in The Rise of Skywalker.
They fly now!
Now, I've refrained from talking about Episode 9 until this point because I think that most people share the same negative sentiment about it, which is that it was a mess, or at least very, very messy. But I think that it's important to emphasize that Episode 9 is the culmination of Disney's poor planning of the series, not the source. Most of it was a reaction to the complaints that people have with The Last Jedi, and just like The Force Awakens, JJ was here to save the day.
He made a lot of surprising story choices in Last Jedi. What surprised you most about that?
I think the most surprising thing, for me was the way he treated Luke. That was the thing that was, I think, for me the most fun.
But in my opinion, every response he made to Rian Johnson's movie only made things worse. Let's make it so that Poe has a love interest for 5 minutes so he has something to fight for. People didn't like how Episode 8 gave us non-answers to the question of Rey's background, so let's make her a descendant of a popular franchise character. Well, we can't do Luke because that's too obvious. So let's add a contrived storyline about how she's the descendant of a clone of Palpatine or something. What you say? Stan Twitter says that changes nothing and her character still lacks depth? Well, she can kiss the E-boy at the end of the movie before he f***ing dies. Throw them a bone, I guess. Well, what about Snoke? Oh, people didn't like how Kylo Ren kills him before we have a chance to learn anything about his character. Well, let's make it so that he's also a clone of Palpatine. Everything is about Palpatine now. The dead speak! Surprise, f***o, it's Palpatine! The whole movie is basically a mix between an RPG side quest and a Marvel movie, specifically Endgame. Bring back beloved old characters on the screen one more time, coupled with endless pop culture references for the fans. They do so much of it, you start not even questioning it.
The dark side of the Force is a pathway to many abilities some consider to be unnatural.
Oh, Lando's on the same planet that the main characters go to, out of mere coincidence? Okay. I guess our philandering playboy's gotten a little creepy looking over the years, and that these guys are the only things in his league.
Hello, what have we here?
Let's also heavily imply that he's the father of Jana, because that doesn't mean anything for the story, and we can make books and TV shows about it. We'll make it so Finn almost confesses to actually being Force sensitive, but then he doesn't for some reason. Wouldn't that be a good asset for the Resistance that you definitely shouldn't keep to yourself? No, dummy. We need to explore the possibility that if Rey joins the dark side, she'll have sharp teeth. So, is Star Wars dead? No, and that's not a good thing. You see, Star Wars is suffering a fate worse than death now. A slow, agonist descent into mediocrity. Sure, Mandalorian is good. There's some interesting plot lines in Clone Wars. And yes, there was a decent amount that I liked about the sequel trilogy. So yeah, we'll continue to get more Star Wars content. Some of it will be good. Some of it will be bad, and very little of it will be great, just like every other franchise. And yes, it's true that it hasn't really been special for a long time now, and that Disney certainly wasn't the first to taint it, but if this was our best shot at recapturing the original trilogy, we're doomed.